No, I'm the executive director at UCR Palm Desert Center, and it's a pleasure to be with you all here tonight. I've been looking forward to this for a very long time. I'm excited that we're doing this lecture tonight on Earth Day, which is a very special day to many of us, hopefully all of us. And Earth Day is really every day, right? But today we're celebrating with Wild Coachella, the second lecture in the series this year. And I mentioned earlier, thank you to Peter Schwartz. And Peter is the person that reached out to say, hey, I saw Dr. Richards speak and thought she was fantastic and think she would be great for a UCR Palm Desert lecture. So thank you, Pete, for that excellent recommendation. I want to thank our Wild Coachella committee, which includes Dr. Cameron Barrows here tonight and Colin Barrows here tonight, and also Elizabeth Erickson. Thank you so much for your help and support putting this lecture series together. We plan on having Wild Coachella once a month for the whole year. So in the past, we ran Wild Coachella from usually November, December through April. But we think we could use a little more Wild Coachella in our lives. So we'll be doing this lecture monthly. And if you have ideas for what you would like to see us do, oh, this says no visual of me. Okay, well, that's good and bad. I'm not sure why. Agam, can you tell me if I'm doing something wrong?
No, we see you. We see
Oh,
you.
someone said no
We see
video of
you.
the speaker. Maybe someone can't see me. And if you can't see me, you can't see that I have for tonight's lecture, a Sean Savage painting behind me, and it's a dog with a very giant nose, which is very important. Okay, so back to where I was. We're going to be doing this every month. And if you have ideas about our Wild Coachella series, something you'd like to see, we have some exciting things planned ourselves. But if there's something you'd like to see, just drop us an email or put something in the chat tonight, or I'll put my email in the chat in a little bit here. I want to shout out to our partners. I see some of you are here with us tonight, UCR Palm Desert Center partners. Thank you so much for all that you do to support our programming. We couldn't do it without you. We couldn't do it when we were meeting in person, and we couldn't do it now if we weren't receiving your support. So thank you for your generosity and for your kindness. Okay, let's see. Next up, I would like to, particularly on Earth Day and every day, acknowledge that UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water and air, the Cahuilla, the Tongva, Los Sueño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. Again, put the questions in the chat. I'm going to in the Q&A, sorry. Converse in the chat, questions in the Q&A, and I'll turn it over now to one of our Wild Coachella committee members, Colin Barrows, who is also a California naturalist from our UCR Palm Desert California Naturalist Program. He's also a climate steward. There you are. And you are like the guru of iNaturalist. We go to you for any technical questions on iNaturalist, so thank you for that. And you're one of the best wildlife photographers I know. I'll add that in there too. And there's a slew of other things that you're really good at, and you're
Thanks.
really good at supporting UCR Palm Desert. So thank you for that. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Tamara, and happy Earth Day, everybody, and thank you for being here. So we're going to be talking about, or hearing about, working dogs and conservation. And before we get there, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the places where you might want to enjoy nature with your dog outdoors in the Coachella Valley, or if you're a local in the Coachella Valley, or here even for a weekend, and bring your canine companion with you. You know, it's really, dogs love being outdoors just as much as we do, right? And we love being outdoors with our dogs. But also at the same time, there's some sort of trade-offs that happen there. There are some ways in which dogs can interact negatively with wildlife or with other people, whether it be rattlesnakes, where the dogs could actually be in danger, or whether it be something like a bighorn sheep where the dogs might be having an adverse effect on them and causing them to avoid an area. So that's why a lot of trails in the Coachella Valley are not quote unquote dog friendly. But there are actually quite a few places that are dog friendly. And so the UCR staff developed this dog friendly hike flyer that we'd like to share with you and hopefully be able to share beyond this meeting and talk about some of those dog friendly hiking trails that are not just nice places to go, but also a nice place to go with your dog. And one of my favorite places to go with or without a dog is the Mission Creek Preserve, which is, and especially right now, it's a really good place to see wildflowers. And it's a nice wide trail. Dogs are allowed. And so there's water running along most of the trail pretty much year round. So that's a really great place to go along Highway 62 in the Desert Hot Springs area. Not too far from there is the Whitewater Preserve, which I think a lot of people know about, but may not be aware that you can bring your dog there. And the same kind of deal as Mission Creek, you're walking along water, the wildflowers are spectacular right now. And you can go to Red Dome, which is a nice, easy day hike. In Palm Desert, there's the Homestead Trail, or which a lot of people think of as the cross hike. There's a little loop you can do actually from the Homestead Trail to the Gabby Hayes Trail or vice versa, which is all dog friendly. And that's a little bit more of a kind of a exercise hike. It's a good uphill trail, but it's pretty short and you get a nice view of Palm Desert if you're in that area. And then in La Quinta, there's several dog-friendly options. There's the La Quinta Cove Oasis and the Bear Creek Nature Trail. So there's a few different Bear Creek trails. It's kind of confusing, but the paved trail that goes down the neighborhood side of the neighborhood there is called the Bear Creek Nature Trail, and that's a definitely dog-friendly trail. Quite a few dogs out there pretty much all the time with their companions, human companions. And the La Quinta Cove Oasis is a nice, little bit more of a walk up against the mountains before you get out into the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains National Monument, which is where the bighorn sheep are found, and that's where the dogs are not allowed. So you'll see signs that say no dogs beyond this point. And then lastly, there's another trail in Rancho Mirage called the Butler Abrams Trail, excuse me, that's not too well known, I think, as a trail at all, but it's there and actually starts in a nice little park on Frank Sinatra, and then goes down into the Whitewater River Channel. So there's some nice, you don't think about the Whitewater River Channel as necessarily being a place where there's trails, but it's home to the present and future CV Link, and a good place to bring your dog and see wildlife along the trail there, and sometimes wildflowers in the spring, and some riparian areas in some parts of the channel. And so those are all good places to go, and in addition to dog parks and neighborhood parks and those kinds of places. And I always like to remind people when you're in these places to make observations for iNaturalist or whatever your eBird, maybe whatever your community science app of choice is, and start to learn about the things that you're seeing on the trail and help others understand more of what's out there in nature. It's a really great way to stay connected with nature and learn more about it. I think that pretty much does it for me. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Barrows, who is going to introduce our speaker for the evening, and wish you all another happy Earth Day and see you on the trail.
Okay. I'm not sure how to make myself show, but that doesn't matter. So I am very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Ngaio Richards, who's going to be our speaker tonight. She is a field biologist and a naturalist at heart, which is exactly how I would describe myself. So I think we would be great friends at some point in time if we get a chance to see each other in person. She also has a soft spot for dung beetles, which I've always thought was my animal messenger here. So I think we have a lot going together as well. Dr. Richards has a PhD in forensic science. And that's something that I actually had never heard of before, but thinking about it in terms of what she's going to be speaking about tonight, it is a perfect connection because dogs are, with their exceptional olfactory capacity, are essentially a living mass spectrometer, and they can act very much like something that will help us or help anyone understand the world around us much, much better. And so I think it was a perfect match. So Dr. Ngaio Richards, it's all up to you to take it away.
Thank you. I will just put on my video for a second so you can see who is actually talking to you. And then I'll just, I'm in a pretty remote part of Montana up against a mountain, basically, so my bandwidth is not fantastic. Thank you very much for the introduction, and happy Earth Day to everyone. It's my great pleasure to be with you this evening. And I'd also like to extend my appreciation to the preamble about dog-friendly trails. You know, we sometimes take for granted the access we get to wild places with the dogs through our work. And of course, it's very important for people to be able to get out and enjoy nature. There's something about enjoying nature with dogs that's very, very profound and special. And we also count on, you know, good trail etiquette. Whenever we work in public areas with our dogs, it can be extremely disruptive otherwise. And of course, you know, we're trying to be careful about observing it ourselves. So next slide, please. Aside from the fact that I greatly appreciate your interest in how we use dogs for conservation purposes, I'm really so pleased to have an opportunity finally to talk about some details around invasive species that I think kind of get glossed over. And it's luxurious to have folks in attendance who are inclined towards natural history. That makes me happy, because there's a lot of natural history elements that we touch on related to the use of dogs for invasive species, you know, things like olfactory or scenting relative to life cycle stage, and just generally lots of natural wonders to contemplate while we're out working with dogs. So I will try to weave those elements in whenever possible. And generally speaking, working with dogs opens your senses in a lot of new ways. And we're such visually oriented creatures, and we've had people come out with us in the field and express skepticism that a dog is, you know, kind of knows what they're doing if they catch sight of something we're looking for and the dog seems to have breezed by it. But we explain, if that happens, that they're working by scent rather than sight. And then you see the dog has actually caught scent of something else that's further off we didn't see, and that's what the dog was working to. So it takes a little adjustment, but if you can relax your senses and fall into a rhythm with the dogs, your search image really changes and your perceptions of your surroundings are altered. Now, of course, I'm going to speak a lot about conservation dogs and show lots of glorious photos, but I just would like to take a few moments to consider the ways that we think about invasive species overall relative to the realities on the ground and to what we can learn from dogs. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So what do we actually mean when we use the words invasive species? Because it's become kind of a catch-all term. And it seems like what we're intending are species that are unwelcome for various reasons in a given habitat or ecosystem. And staying with this catch-all invasive species term, perceptions around what constitutes an invasive species, those perceptions really matter. And I joke sometimes that working with native and imperiled and non-native species has ruined at least one of my favorite children's books, which is shown here. But I'm not entirely joking, because if you consider images from the book where the main theme is how the heroine of the story is spreading beauty in the world and she's planting lupins, and lupins are they can be pretty prolific. And you look at a colorful field full of lupin and you think, oh, it's so pretty, how much harm can it do? And in fact, the original makeup of that field is being altered by the presence of the lupins that are proliferating. Now, on the other hand, you might see a plant that's very spiky, say a star thistle or a creature that has big teeth and bulging eyes and have this visceral reaction. You might think, oh, that must do awful things. And that's human nature. And sometimes it's true that those species are harmful. But in this case, I think it doesn't go without saying that all species emanate from somewhere they belong, and they aren't thriving in an area out of malevolence. It's a matter of survival and of them going elsewhere, or usually being brought elsewhere and finding favorable conditions. Next slide, please. So how might these differing definitions and perceptions affect the management approaches for a given species? And these are some terms that might be used interchangeably or kind of along a tight continuum, but they actually mean different things, and they have varying degrees of threat associated with them, and that's going to impact on how they're managed and approached. In a big picture sense, the main question is how a given species will interact within a given ecosystem, and if it has a potential to alter the ecosystem and adversely affect the other occupants. So the catch-all invasive term signifies that given the chance, a species is going to infiltrate an ecosystem, but it can do that to varying degrees. If it's even remotely aggressive, and here zebra and quagga mussels certainly come to mind, and an aquatic plant like giant salvinia, which is wreaking havoc in Texas, they're going to outgrow and replace native species in a way that's extremely disruptive. Whereas native mussels filter water, zebra and quagga mussels have a tendency to foul it, and they gunk up beaches and irrigation infrastructure with razor-sharp shells. Invasive species can replace similar types of native species. So you might think, well, what's the harm then? You're kind of getting a substitute, but they might be unpalatable or less nutritious, things like that, to the native species that would otherwise feed on them. And they also tend to have strategies for taking over very quickly once they intrude. So again, going back to mussels, a single female mussel could produce, in theory, about 1 million eggs. So several times I've seen mint given as a counterexample. It's aggressive in that it takes over your garden if you let it, but it's not likely to escape from the confines of your yard. So for large-scale management, true aggressivity would be tied to how quickly a species can take hold once it infiltrates and how costly and onerous that would be to redress. And so here, if you're thinking about dogs, a goal would be to prevent infestation by keeping aggressive species out of an area, an uninfested area to begin with. And this can be a scenario where conservation dog handler teams could be useful, either relative to or in conjunction with other available tools and approaches. Species like a toad that exudes poison on the surface of its skin, and dogs can be poisoned by licking them, that would be designated as noxious. So that's another term that gets floated around sometime, but it's not interchangeable. It can take hundreds of years, at least for natural grassland, to reach a state of dynamic equilibrium, and only a few seasons for that all to be undone. And aside from financial and agricultural repercussions, there's some really poignant ecological repercussions too. For example, habitats taken over by knapweed were deemed suboptimal by a species of sparrow, and that ultimately led to less experienced older males occupying habitats where younger males would hear them and incorporate some of their song. And that led to a less rich singing repertoire. And so the depth of that impact really amazes and saddens me. And then to To go on with some of these definitions, exotic or introduced is another way of saying non-native. And just because a plant is non-native, that doesn't mean it's invasive per se. There are plenty of ornamentals who'll just stay put and mind their own business in your garden. So as I shift us now to talking about dogs, just bear in mind these definitions and consider how we think about native and imperiled species. And these distinctions, also bear in mind, they make absolutely no difference to a detection dog who just is out there looking for and wishing to find what we are asking them to. Next slide, please. So I know it wasn't necessary to provide you with both of these charts, but I loved them, and I'm kind of a big fan of fish, so I loved them and the color so much I couldn't decide. So there we are. We have both. So I think this is extremely interesting. It's another important nuance, is that it's tempting to think that invasive species are simply unwanted in your midst and they originate from very far away. But here in North America, which is admittedly it's a large landmass, but we have species that are considered invasive in one part and native in another, like brook trout. And it's also possible to have species proliferating as invasives in one part of the world and at risk in the region they emanate from. So in theory, you could have a dog who's trained to the same species, but with a different conservation mandate depending on your location. And I just finally like to note a great area that arises from the term nuisance species. For example, some mustelids like otter that are in where resource conflict arises with humans. Many native species are considered to fall in the nuisance category. Next slide, please. So that's enough with definitions. Let's really start talking about dogs now. People have partnered with dogs to achieve many conservation objectives for at least a century, I'd say notably in New Zealand, and about 25 years ago in the United States, we had a consortium of people who got together, and that's including my organization's founders, and they wanted to see how the method could be implemented here with some specific conservation aims. And because of different backgrounds, approaches and objectives, the consortium then budded off into different groups. And in the years since, we have now an increasing number of conservation dog groups springing up like amoebas across the country and around the world. Working Dogs for Conservation was founded in 2000 by 4 female biologists. And since then, we've worked on well over 65 targets across more than 19 states and 16 countries. And we have a rich roster of dog and human staff worldwide. We're headquartered in Montana, and many, but not all of our dogs have come to us from shelters. Next slide. So why all the fuss about dogs? First of all, this nose belongs to a sweet girl named Vika. A dog's sense of smell, I mean, it's just simply phenomenal. It's certainly vastly superior to ours. And one way to visualize how superior is that if you were to compare the number of olfactory cells humans have relative to dogs, ours would fit on a postage stamp, and those of dogs would fit onto a football field. So you can also think of dogs being able to detect down to a threshold that's about equivalent to a cup of sugar poured into an Olympic-sized pool. And other animals are endowed with olfactory prowess, or they make use of olfaction in the neatest of ways. Elephants, surprisingly, some birds. We usually think birds don't have a sense of smell. It's not true. A lot of them do. Other species like bees, ants, and termites also make use of olfaction. But dogs are animals we've long coexisted alongside and evolved a lasting bond with, and that facilitates a working partnership. Next slide, please. In essence, conservation detection dogs are engaged in tasks that protect habitats, ecosystems, and all the creatures that occupy them. And in the early days, conservation dog work was principally considered to be more on the ecological monitoring end of things. For example, looking for fecal matter, what we call scat. So you're looking for for the scat, in which there's a lot of information without having to make contact with the animal itself. Law enforcement applications like anti-poaching were considered more distinct, but now we typically include in the conservation dog bucket these kinds of very complementary overlapping applications like pesticide poison detection, interception of contraband. And it's worth highlighting here that the illegal trade in flora and fauna siphons just a huge number of non-native species all over the world. So there's really lots of overlap. Next slide, please. I love this picture. The Rogues Gallery. Now, the longstanding bond and the superior sense of smell I mentioned before, that doesn't mean any and all dogs are automatically suited for detection work. And people will often ask if there are any breeds that are better suited to this work than others. And some of the traits and temperaments, even body sizes, shapes, or the outward appearance that is best suited for our work and our purposes could coincide with certain breeds. But as an organization, we're not breed fixated. And we have specific criteria for a reputable breeder. And relative to all the training and conditioning that then goes into each dog before they might deploy on a first project, and then throughout their lives, sourcing candidate dogs from shelters, that does provide an enormous upfront cost savings. But I want to stress it's not the fact of the dog being in a shelter that brings them to our attention. And we're really looking for a suite of very specific traits, a certain type of drive, toy obsession, and that makes for what we would say is a lot of dog. It's more than most sensible people in search of a pet dog certainly signed on for, which is why we often find these dogs in shelters. They're really lousy pets. And we also look for things like willingness to work with a handler. That's crucial. And being a conservation dog handler, I'll just say here, it's as much or more a lifestyle choice than a career. It's far less or not at all about being able to recognize individual breeds or having a full roster of training certificates to your name, but it is all about loving the grueling pace and the intensive project roster that is inherent to the work. Next slide, please. And people often say, oh, my dog is crazy about toys. I bet they could do this work. And I think, oh, trust me, you don't want this kind of toy crazy in your dog. So that beady-eyed look, this is what toy obsession looks like to us. And in a shelter, and that's an overstimulating environment, as many of you know, if you bounce a ball down a line of enclosures, toy obsessed dogs are going to stop everything they're doing and fixate. They're not fixating on you, they're fixating on the ball, and even with all the barking and the carrying on that's going around them. And that's a first indication that the dog could be a candidate, but that's really only a first step, because when all is said and done, it's something like a dog in at least 1,000 that has all the unique sets of traits we require of them to do this work. And this is after multiple successive vetting stages. And aside from having the ability and the potential, the dog also has to desire to do the job. And if it turns out that they don't, then we find them a forever home in our network where they're going to be celebrated and understood for all their quirks with a person or people who really get them. And these dogs don't have an off switch. I can't say it enough. They're just go, go, go. And they need a meaningful outlet where we can keep them out of trouble. And my old dog who retired last year, so he's 13, and he's actually just on the other side of the table staring at me, shifting from foot to foot. So they're delightful, but they're just an awful lot of dog. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of some of the targets and applications we've worked with dogs to find or to learn about, and it's it's already out of date. As the years go by, it feels like we come up with a list and then within a month or so it's out of date. So you can see how these targets and applications span ecological monitoring, some enforcement, invasive and biohazards, and environmental contaminants monitoring. And before, when I said a dog has to want the job, even an established conservation dog won't likely be able to work universally to all targets. And some of these targets, for example, if they carry a fainter scent, not because not all targets give equal amount of scent or equally detectable, that requires a special skill set and temperament in a dog, because it might require a more intensive search strategy, for example, like you would use for landmine detection. And other times, other traits might be required based on the habitat you would be working in for a particular target. And that's going to be over and above what a dog requires fundamentally for this already challenging work. Next slide, please. Now, conservation dogs are trained using principles and methods that are similar to those used in other detection disciplines, for example, narcotics and explosives work, but their actual service looks quite different. And our dogs can be called upon to look for multiple, relatively varied targets over their careers, sometimes searching for them at the same time. And they'll work across a range of different terrains at different intensities. In some detection disciplines, it would be prohibitively dangerous, or it might be at odds with jurisdiction to have dogs trained to more than a single target or category of target, but they have the capacity to acquire many. Some of our dogs have 30 or more targets that they are able to find. And fundamentally, we train each dog to associate, finding and then relaying to us the presence of what the thing is that we're interested in, with getting the reward that they covet the most, which is some playtime. And people say, that's it, that's what they're working for, that's all they want. Yes, that's all they want. And we make the process as straightforward as possible to start with, to ingrain their learning of the scent, and then we increase the complexity, but still in a controlled way. The latter stages of the vetting process involve training. So it's at this point that we get to test a dog's drive and desire to do the work. And in some cases, they actually have to learn to play appropriately and safely first, which can be endearing and heartbreaking at the same time. But that all gets rolled into their training. Next, please. And this little image, I think, nicely conveys the role we play as handlers and as partners to these dogs. We help them navigate our way through the scentscape and support them in their search based on our own understanding of scent and how it interacts within the environment. And we're geared to their behavior, but also to certain environmental cues and landscape features relative to the target. And we're also keeping track of exactly where we've been, where we're going, and we're being vigilant to any potential risks. And we're tuned to any signs the dog might need a break or some hydration or a snack. Above all, we keep them safe. Next, please. Okay, so before I started preparing this talk, I asked for a list of invasive and imperiled species in your area so that I could just incorporate a few species you'd recognize. And it was pretty interesting, to pour through the iNaturalist links, and there are hundreds of plant and animal species listed. Like everywhere else, you have species that are pervasively present, like house sparrows and European starlings, and those pretty aggressively displaced birds. And then it seems like, you have some species with more distinctly negative effects, but they occupy a narrower range of areas. The examples I was provided with were crawfish or bullfrogs, for example. The American bullfrog is an example of a species that falls under the gray nuisance area I was talking about before with mink and otter. They're native, but they're also a menace. And then there were some other plants or some other species raised, like tamarisk, fountain grass. What I want to say here is that there could be plenty of reasons for wanting to explore the use of dogs for any of these outlined species. It seems like you have quite a few mustards, and in flower, those look pretty similar. Dogs can be very helpful to distinguish species that people have a difficulty to visually discriminate between. But all the factors would have to line up with ways we know dogs can be most useful relative to other tools and strategies. We're always having to think about what else might be available relative to dogs. And we might ask things like, well, how does it present at each stage of its life cycle? When might it be most detectable? What other species does it occur with? What kind of hazards are present in the environment? Next, please. So let's look at some examples where dogs are being used to combat aggressive invasive species, and I can better explain what I mean about some of these nuances, and starting with zebra and quagga mussels, which I really think could be the poster child for aggressive invasives. I want to give a big kudos to our partners, especially in Alberta and Texas, who are implementing mussel dog teams. There's a bunch of other ones too. What we find is that overall a dog team can more rapidly inspect watercraft and find mussels than a human inspector. But human inspectors, it must be said, are very good and they're very thorough. The practicalities are when you have like a weekend fishing derby that you're trying to get, then having you need to have confidence that your inspections are thorough, and you need to keep things moving. And for snowbirds traveling across state lines who have had to go through multiple watercraft inspections, potentially sometimes in the same state, dogs can generate a lot of goodwill and increase confidence. You know, if a mussel is found, then the boat has to be decontaminated before they can get on the road again. And this isn't an either or an us and them proposition. It's ideal to have a dog team going about their business while an inspector explains what the team's doing, and then gives a chance for outreach and generates interest that you wouldn't otherwise get. And even if you say to somebody that a female mussel can lay up to 1 million eggs, I said that before, it's still hard for people to wrap their head around the damage that a single mussel could do to an uninfested water body, ecologically and economically, unless they've somehow experienced that firsthand. So the mussel dog teams and the human inspectors have a very solid partnership. And of course, there's a detection component and there's an efficiency component, but the dogs are also just bringing a lot of human public interest and public goodwill. Next, please. Dyer's woad is a biennial in the mustard family. Speaking of mustards, it's native to Eurasia and it's kind of to Idaho and Wyoming. What spotted duckweed is becoming for us here in Montana. So for the last decade, our dog teams have been helping to monitor and manage Dyer's woad across Montana. And one of the sites is Mount Sentinel in Missoula, and that spans about 200, the face of it spans about 200 acres. And before the search effort intensified, and that included us getting involved with our dog teams, volunteers were hand pulling hundreds, like 600 plants per season, many of them large flat area shown in the bottom right hand map. And in 2015, we went mostly just single dog teams monitoring up there, and we managed to reduce the hotspot to the core that you see on the right. And we're pulling far fewer plants every season now. And because using dogs enabled us to find and intercept small rosettes before they reach the dreaded reproductive stage, we learned that a lot of things, and we saw a real reduction in the number of plants we were pulling from up there. And we learned that the dogs could generalize from just initial exposure to rosettes to going out into the field and also telling us about flowering and seeding plants. And then in upcoming seasons, so we tried to train to all the life cycle stages when possible. And the first season we got the neatest lesson because one of the dogs, also trained as a cadaver dog, kept alerting to a place where her handler didn't see anything, and she marked the spots, and sure enough, when they returned a while later, there were actually little rosettes showing. So the dog had been alerting to remnant roots, and from what we learned, so she was alerting to the remnant roots, and we learned that they were still producing leaves, and so that told us that hand pulling by itself was insufficient, that we also needed to do some targeted herbicide spraying. And again, being able to pinpoint remnant root and patch locations means a direct rather than blanket herbicide application. So that's easier on the native seed banks and growth. And a caveat here is that for where we've identified places that are woad seed banks, we're kind of in a holding pattern because there aren't products that we know of to cap the germination without, and also not do harm to the native seed bank. Next slide, please. So this is just to show you a really good day's haul, very, very satisfying for me and the dog. One morning off Mount Sentinel in one of the hotspot areas in late spring. Next slide, please. And just to put those finds in perspective, we're talking about scouring a highly vegetated sloped surface, you know, a sea of green, and making tiny finds like the one in my hand on the right. And the left photo is actually a reserve in Iowa, but the point is just that we're such visual creatures and we wouldn't have the capacity to distinguish one plant from another the way that dogs can by scent, certainly not getting the kind of intensive, efficient coverage that we do with dogs. Next slide, please. So I'm winding down. Before I said dogs don't make the distinction between invasive and imperiled species, and I also mentioned dogs can be trained to multiple compatible species and search for some of these simultaneously. At the Neil Smith Refuge in Iowa, we'd started searching for Chinese bush clover several seasons prior, and then a few seasons ago, my coworkers also searched the same area for whorled milkweed, which is important for the monarch butterfly. And what they found was that prior efforts had greatly reduced the non-native bush clover, and that there was more whorled milkweed in the reserve than managers anticipated. So that was a great joy and a big win to discover. And here we see this beautiful girl, that's Miss Wicket. She had found whorled milkweed and was enjoying some well-deserved chew time with her ball, and just try to imagine finding a plant like this in the midst of this kind of grassland habitat by yourself. Next, please. So this is, to me, perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of our work, and it's when you're assessing new targets or a variation on a target. A big question isn't so much whether or not the dogs can detect or discriminate it on the face of it, but if they can do that as it occurs in its natural environment or according to the needed application. So bumblebee nests have been a prime example for us. It would be terrific to be able to incorporate dogs in some way to bumblebee conservation efforts. And we know from experience that the nest material is extremely straightforward for a dog to learn in a controlled training situation. People are able, after a time, to identify different species by smell. It's fragrant, it smells delicious. But once in the real world, especially for bees that are nesting underground, the scent picture and scent availability becomes drastically different, and it's more challenging for dogs, and it's more challenging for the way that we work with dogs. So when that's the case, it might mean you need to use a more intensive search strategy. Sometimes that can alleviate some of the issues, you know, but it also might mean that dogs aren't going to be viable in the way you were anticipating based on how initial training seemed to be going. That just is something that can happen. You get into the field and you need further time to acclimate and troubleshoot to the target. And we always learn so much from the dogs when that happens and we get to troubleshoot. It's very humbling and rewarding. Next slide, please. So we're quite, not only are we visual, but we're literal minded in thinking that dogs primarily benefit conservation through their detection, work, and prowess. But there's unexpected ways dogs can help. And for one thing, their ambassadorial value just can't be overstated. And from the moment project partners or stakeholders, members of the public learn dogs are involved, their interest is usually piqued. It's not counterintuitive in the sense that people usually love dogs, but I think we always underestimate just the ways that dogs open doors of engagement for us with people that we on our own just wouldn't, no matter what we said or how hard we try to be engaging and charming. So for some of the species outlined for your area relative to using dogs, the first things you might consider are where on the continuum of non-native to aggressive they fall, because if they aren't terribly aggressive, then a more concerted awareness campaign, and that could feature dogs for demonstrations or, in children's outreach materials or something, that might be a great way to generate awareness. Another question to ponder would be density and visibility. If there's enough of these organisms and they're large enough for people to be able to try and deal with first, in the case of crawfish and the bullfrog, they're aggressive, but if they're confined to a more limited area, that could be a viable use of dogs, if you really want to hit one area specifically. And then at lower density, it can also be appropriate to bring dogs in because that's more challenging for people. But even at higher density, if you have something like a mustard, which can be hard to distinguish, then dogs might still be able to help because again, they're using scent, whereas our eyes would fail us potentially in this aspect. And I'm saying all this to give you the gist, but really this is case by case, and the thing to do would be to consult extensively with a conservation dog professional, and there are several groups all across the United States, and you really want to think through and brain shoot the logistics and the minutiae of getting the samples and training and fielding. And I'm not saying this in a promotional way. I'm saying this in the sense that there's a lot that goes into it. And sometimes you're thinking about an application and then you talk about it and realize you can still address your main question with dogs, but coming at it from a slightly different angle. And just in terms of outreach and awareness, I just did want to mention that, like nurseries and gardening companies play an unintended promoting the spread of invasives and non-native species, whether these are from North America or elsewhere. So it's good to be able to have some outreach because like you can have non-native plants in your garden that aren't taking over, but they're also not really contributing much, whether that's nutritionally or otherwise. If you're a pollinator enthusiast and you wanted to have a great butterfly garden, but you're not really you're providing a milkweed, but it's not a native milkweed, and it's maybe suboptimal habitat. And then honeybee keepers are another good candidate for outreach because a lot of honeybee species are from Europe and not typically associated with any negative effects per se, but beekeepers may also try to provide European floral species for the bees. And if you think about something like purple loosestrife, which is gorgeous but incredibly aggressive, that's a problem. And again, for this sort of outreach, you could have a meet and greet with a conservation dog, and to help bolster engagement, you could create outreach materials. I guess finally, I just encourage people to apprise themselves a little bit of the species and their designations for the state. Next slide. And then very important to quickly give a shout out to this terrific product. It gives us so much peace of mind when we're in the field for cheatgrass especially. It was designed by a woman right there where you are in California, and it's been fun working with her because we've done some product testing over the years with her, and she's been really open to making modifications based on some of our suggestions because she loves dogs and she's very engaged in functional design, and that makes the product even better for pet dogs too. Next slide. So this is my second to last slide, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about our dog life program, because it's the cornerstone of everything we do, whether that involves searching or vetting candidate dogs, adoption, assessment, training, rehoming, retirement. As I mentioned before, if a dog doesn't want the job or otherwise doesn't make the cut, we go to great lengths to ensure they find their just right forever home. And during the time they've often picked up a little obedience and social skills along the way. So that's good. Our handlers love the work, and we put in hard and we're in the field. And these dogs are like athletes. So don't wait here to start a regime of acupuncture, hydrotherapy, for knee, while they're still working to stay and comfortable from needed. Throughout their lives, they get a diet, they get all sorts of trimmings. They don't get any less bossy or active environment. I can from experience, iPhone is an off switch we could flip once in a while, but there isn't. But once they retire, they still get a full regimen of conditioning and needed. We just want them to have a full, rich life, and it's the least we can do for all they've given us and all they've contributed to conservation efforts around the world. And last, I didn't mean to drop off, sorry. last but not least, for all the natural history people there, especially all the nature lovers on Earth Day, there is nothing like being out looking or doing ecological monitoring with a dog. And I've surveyed for all kinds of animals and plants on my own, but once I started partnering with the dog, it just changed the way I see the landscape. And like I said, alters your senses. You're simultaneously acting as a conduit for the dog. And when you see through their body language that they seem to have caught scent, the whole landscape comes alive in the most remarkable way. It's like you have a current of electricity running through you. And I never ever cease to feel lucky I get to do this, and I get to discover every time how little I know and how much I still have to learn through these dogs. And that gives me joy. So thank you for your attention, and happy Earth Day. And I hope this was useful to all of you.
Well, Dr. Richards, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. For the rest of you, she is talking from a fairly remote area in Montana. And so her bandwidth is a bit limited, but it worked out fairly well. And so thank you very much. That was spectacular. I was going to mention that I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but there is some research going on here in the Coachella Valley that has utilized working dogs in much the same way you're talking about. As you might imagine, this is an area where energy production is very much on people's minds, and that can take many different forms. But here in the Coachella Valley, wind energy is one of the biggest obvious features. And there's thousands of windmills at the western end of the valley. But there's a question that researchers have had from the start, whether while the wind energy is good and it's clean for in terms of carbon production, there is an environmental cost, and people wanted to quantify that. And they found that humans were terrible at determining that they could walk underneath the windmills and they wouldn't see any mortality for any animals, birds or bats or anything like that. And so the assumption was that there was very little damage happening to local wildlife at all. But they started using dogs, and they found out it was actually much, much different than that the dogs were finding many, many, many different animals of various types that were being damaged by the windmills. And they've just published a paper on it showing that the amount of energy produced by a given windmill is directly proportional to how much mortality it causes. So it's a real interesting finding that dogs were able to be pivotal in what they provided for that understanding. Dr. Richards, just one quick question. I was just wondering if you had sort of a favorite scenario where you and your dogs were doing monitoring of one kind or another that you would like to relate, whether it was invasive species or looking for an endangered animal or plant. What was your favorite experience that you had?
Oh, that's a very generous but also a very difficult question because I could go by the landscape where and I can't narrow it down, but maybe being in Arctic Alaska and then being in the jungles of Cameroon, I would say those were two of the most incredible places to be. But then if I think about some of the work we did just along the riverbanks of Montana, those are also a favorite, and that's partly because of it was in the autumn and the smells of the autumn, the sort of bitter, acrid, and my dog was just going looking for otter scat, so he had his nose down, and I just happened to look up at the right time, and an otter came tearing down the river, popped up his or her head and looked at us for a moment. I just looked up at the right time and just ploop and continued. So there I am seeing the animal. Here's my dog completely oblivious to the whole thing. It was just kind of magical.
Very nice. Well, I think Colin Barrows is going to go through the questions that have showed up in the chat room. So Colin, why don't you take over there?
Sure. Let's see. Elizabeth so that we had, in the beginning of the presentation, there was a picture of a dog on a sand dune, and Elizabeth wanted to know where that was taken, whether it was in Montana or somewhere else. You happen to remember?
Yes, that was in the Kobuk National Park, which is in the Arctic in Alaska.
Alaska.
Really, really cool ecosystem. Yeah.
And then Elizabeth has another question about what research she did to learn that dogs had the olfactory abilities to smell invasive species. I guess maybe where did the invasive species work start with dogs? When did that become clear that that was a possibility?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to exactly when. I'm not sure. I don't think we piloted that, so it could have had like we started, I think, about 20 years ago or so, but it could have been happening before. Like I mentioned, folks in New Zealand have been partnering with Dogs for Conservation work for like in 100 years about. So there could have been some forays into that before. For us, it's been about 20 years that we've been looking into this.
That question brings up a question I thought of when we, during your presentation, you talked about the dogs being able to differentiate or to detect not just the flowering or blooming plants, but also the basal rosettes and even just the roots. Can you talk a little bit about like what do they actually smell? When if it's the roots, what are they smelling?
I would say that the roots might be more abundantly scented than the seeding stage, because the seeding stage, it's really desiccated. The plant has really put everything it has into. Well, I'm just thinking about something like Dyer's Woad. It's not very moist, so it's not giving off a lot of scent. It's partly to do with the search strategy. If you're covering a big area, you're making sure the dog is getting their head down a fair bit of the time so that they're able to get a good, even though they have very good detection thresholds, like 10 or 15 meters, we've seen them show a change of behavior. some of that has to do with just making sure they're getting their noses in all the right places. And then, yeah, in terms of the roots, in terms of the rosettes, there are, like Dyer's Woad is a great one because it's fairly leafy. It gives off a good amount of scent. But there are other plants that are more woody, for example, and that's harder for the dogs to get. They're more stingy with the scent they give off. So the dog, like if we train, we would give them exposure to roots, we would give them exposure to the rosette stage, to the flowering stage, and then to the seeding stage, so they could put all of it together in their mind. So they're really good at composing the scent picture as they're exposed to it, if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. And we had a question from Anne about the face net on the dog, wanting to know what the purpose was. Maybe you could just articulate a little, or sort of go into a little more detail there on, I think maybe your audio was breaking up at that point, why the face net is important that the dogs wear when they're in the field.
Yeah, and I'm very sorry for the
No worries.
the lousy audio. It's
really
the perils
like
of living in a really beautiful place. So yeah, that is called the Outfox Field Guard. It looks sometimes a little bit like a medieval device, and we've had people say, "Oh, is that because your dog bites?" But it's not. Nothing of the sort. It's to protect the dog's nose, especially, but also their ears, their eyes, anywhere that seeds can get in, because that can actually kill a dog, or can cause them great harm. So especially with our dogs who are putting their noses down and sniffing deeply, if you're in an area where you've got seeds and awns, and especially for us, it was cheatgrass. You don't want any of that going into any parts of the dog. And it's what she has created in this face mask is really helps us to go into an area with peace of mind. And we're still very vigilant, but we don't have to be they're not going in bareheaded to places where they can be, because they don't care. They're just working, and they're just plowing through the vegetation. And so, but for pet dogs, it's very handy, because it's the same thing. It's going to keep and you would still have to do a full body check, at the end, because you can still get seeds that go in, but it's just a really effective barrier for much of the vegetation that would break off, or the seed heads or what have you.
That brings up another point. I imagine that you have to be pretty careful if you're in a place with a lot of invasive species, that the dogs are not being vectors of transferring seeds between locations. A lot of these seeds are designed, they're evolutionary methods of transfer, or to get caught in fur and things like that.
Yes, that's a very, very good point. And yes, that's often that's part of our protocol, not just for the dog safety, but also we do the body checks to make sure we're not inadvertently undoing some of the good work by transferring seeds. And we also do that we have similar protocols for disease, for example, to both to protect the dogs and also to protect the species that we're working with. So we're very mindful of the dogs and ourselves being a bit of a conduit, potentially, like going into an area where there's a particular hazard, and just making sure that hazard stays where it is and not transfer it elsewhere.
Great. Michael has a question, and he says he was born in Montana and returns often, and he wants to know if you have any stories of interesting findings during the spring after things have thawed.
During the spring after things have thawed. That's
things that were buried under the snow, question. I guess, is his question that came to the surface.
Well, it's not in the spring. I don't know if this is going to be a satisfying answer, but it was in the autumn. We were surveying in the Lima snowline region we were looking again for Dyer's Woad, and it was snowing, and which is delightful, but I thought, oh, well, how are we going to do this? Because we hadn't done that before. And then I also thought we were kind of past the season, but sure enough, we got into an area and the dog started hitting on rosettes. And what we had found, and that changed how we surveyed afterwards, what we found, so all the native plants had hunkered down and the dyer's woad was just because we'd had snow, but we'd also had a sun, and so it was delighted, and it was getting a good head start to go into the winter and to come into spring. And so thank goodness we found that, because then we started to go out later to make sure we could apprehend those breakout rosettes, so that we wouldn't have any nasty surprises in the spring. So I kind of turned the season around on him, but I don't know if that's an acceptable answer to the question.
There's no wrong answers, right? So we had a question in the chat about whether we have dog trainers in the Coachella Valley that specialize in this kind of work and in this kind of doing these kinds of working dogs. So I guess there is some research going on now, but is your organization, it sounds like you go all over the world. How does that kind of work?
Well, we do, but we also have colleagues. We've got rogue detection teams who are in Washington, and there's pack leader also in Washington, and conservation canine. So there's a whole bunch of us who are, and we travel domestically and we travel internationally. And that's what I was alluding to before about it, if you wanted to explore, there's a few of us that you could get in touch with and just get a sense of what that might entail. And we all have a lot of similarities, obviously, but we do have some different approaches too. So it's worth talking to everybody to really get a sense of what it might entail.
So I imagine if someone in the Coachella Valley had a project that they wanted to use a conservation dog on, they could contact you, and if it wasn't something that you were able to help on, you could refer them to somebody who could.
Yes, we absolutely would.
Great. Let's see. There's another question here about what is the training concept that you're using to train dogs for the job, and how long does it take from the start of the training until they're ready to go in the field?
I'm not sure I understand in terms of the training concept.
I'm not sure. Maybe they can follow up, but at least maybe for the second part of the question, how long
Yeah, it's
does it take?
a few. Well, I mean, it can be a matter of weeks or months. It doesn't take as long once the dogs have figured out the game, so to speak. But because in principle it's fairly similar, but there are some targets that are more challenging than others, and so that requires more of the dog. But yeah, at first it can be up to a year for a green dog, and then it goes to weeks and months.
And then John had kind of maybe a related question. He says, once they've been trained, do you have to continually reinforce? Like you mentioned, a dog that had was trained in 30 different scents. Are they able to go back to the first one they learned, or do they need to be reinforced a little bit?
So I'll answer that sort of in reverse. If you go out on a hike with a dog who's trained to bear scat, and you suddenly realize they're not with you by your side, and you turn around and they're just sitting primly off to the side because they found bear scat. So they really want their toy at all costs, and they'll go if they think they might have a chance to get their toy, they'll tell you about, even if they're off duty. So that's part of the answer to the question, which is that they don't forget and they can be quite contextual. If you're going to the same place every year, the same sort of habitat, they pick it up quickly. But obviously, to be efficient, you want to give them a refresher training before you would go out, to make sure that everything is still clear for them. So they don't, they, like I say, you could be out and they would be like, hey, do you want to reward me for this? And then they very quickly, you know, if they're not getting a reward, they're just going to continue with the leisure hike. Another thing though, then that's a good question. And I think it's worth mentioning. Sometimes people are concerned about dogs being trained on several targets that might occur in the same area. And usually what happens is you start off and the dog, and it can be really neat because you can be in an area where you didn't even think this other species might be occurring. And all of a sudden the dog is telling you, oh yeah, but this species is also here. But the thing is that they know if they're not getting rewarded for it, you're not going to extinguish, you're not going to ruin the dog. The dog's not going to be huffy and sort of be like, well, if you don't reward me for this, I'll never try to find it for you again. They just learn, and you can do this by making a really big party the first time you find the actual target. You can just give them the notion that, no, you're not getting, we're not looking for this. You're only getting rewarded for this. And they will switch off.
That's really interesting. Okay, we have one final question, and then we'll let you go, which is from Kristen, and she wants to know who trains the dogs and where are they trained? Is there like a facility that you bring the dogs to be trained once you've found a candidate, or do you train them on site?
The bulk of the training is done at our facility, which is just outside of Missoula, but there's some pre-training that goes into candidates. We try to work with shelters when there's a candidate dog, and the staff are usually very generous, you know, because they just want the best for that dog. We try to work with them, like pre-training in the sense of maybe some obedience or just working out some behavioral issues. We might work with the dog remotely and the staff, so they're still at the shelter. But in terms of the conservation targets, those are done at our facility outside Missoula.
Well, thank you again for Dr. Richards for sharing your knowledge with us, and thank you all for being with us. I think we're out of questions, and so we'll close by reminding you to save the date for our next Wild Coachella talk, which will be by a UCR staff member, Paisley Ramstead. Will be talking about snakes on May 20th. So that'll be, Paisley is like really excited about snakes and passionate about snakes. So that'll be a one that you don't want to miss. Of course, who doesn't like snakes? Other than that, I think everybody have a great evening and a wonderful Earth Day. And hopefully you'll get to spend some time with your dogs, your own dogs over the weekend, or maybe your friends' dogs or family's dogs over the weekend. And have a good weekend.